The chainsaw roared to life at exactly 5 a.m., shattering the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. Sparks flew as metal met metal, and the screeching sound echoed down the pristine, HOA-regulated streets. Lights flicked on one by one in every house, blinds shifted, and neighbors peeked out, horrified and intrigued. Right in the middle of it all, standing in her perfectly manicured driveway in a leopard print robe and fuzzy slippers, was Linda, the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association. Her mouth was wide open in shock. I didn't stop. I revved the chainsaw again, slicing through the old wooden fence that had started this whole mess. If she didn't want a fence, fine. I had a better idea, much bigger idea, and Linda was about to find out just how much I was willing to escalate. Moving into the neighborhood had felt like a dream at first. The kind of place where lawns were trimmed to perfection, sidewalks were spotless, and kids rode their bikes without a care in the world. I had just bought my first house, a beautiful 2-story home with a big backyard, a far cry from the cramped apartments I had lived in for years. It was supposed to be my escape, my peaceful little slice of heaven. But heaven had a gatekeeper, and her name was Linda. I first met her within 24 hours of moving in. There was no warm welcome, no friendly plate of cookies, just a sharp knock on my door followed by a woman in her mid-50s with a clipboard, a tight smile, and the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." "James, is it?" she said, not waiting for an answer. "I'm Linda, the HOA president. I just wanted to go over a few things." A few things turned out to be a printed list of violations I had apparently committed before I even unpacked my last box. My mailbox was half an inch too tall, my garbage cans were placed in the wrong spot, and my grass-meet brand new grass was, according to her, the wrong shade of green. I tried to be polite. I really did. But after the third VY sit in 2 days, where she criticized my porch light for being too bright, I started to realize Linda wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was on a power trip, and I was her latest VY-Tim. Then came the fence incident. I had built a simple wooden fence, nothing fancy, nothing outrageous, just a normal, standard privacy fence to keep my dog from wandering off, and, more importantly, to keep Linda from constantly peering into my backyard. The moment she saw it, you'd think I had set the neighborhood on fire. "You can't just put up a fence," she shrieked, storming up my driveway. "It violates HOA policy." I blinked. "There are literally fences all over the neighborhood." "Those were approved," she snapped. "Yours is an eyesore." "How is mine different?" "Because," she huffed, folding her arms, "I don't like it." That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. This wasn't about the neighborhood. This was about control. She started fining me almost immediately. First, a warning notice. Then an official violation. Then daily fines, 50 today, 50 today, 100 tomorrow. It was ridiculous. But when I asked for proof that my fence broke any rules, she had nothing. Because legally speaking, I had done nothing wrong. So I did the only logical thing. I ignored her. And that's when she really lost it. One morning, I stepped outside to find her measuring my lawn with a tape measure, scowling like a disappointed schoolteacher. A week later, she had a tow truck ready to haul away my perfectly registered car because it was parked at the wrong angle. She even went as far as to call the city on me, claiming I was creating an unsafe environment with my fence. That was the final straw. If Linda wanted a war, she was going to get one. I called up my buddy, Chris, an engineer with a love for over-the-top projects. When I told him what was happening, he laughed so hard he nearly dropped his phone. "Dude," he said between wheezes, "you need to go nuclear. Build a fortress. No, build a barricade." At first, I thought he was joking. But the more I thought about it, the more I loved the idea. If she thought my little wooden fence was a problem, she hadn't seen anything yet. I spent the next 2 weeks drawing up plans not for a fence, but for a 15-foot-tall, steel-reinforced barricade. I checked the HOA rule book twice. Nowhere did it say anything about steel barricades. There were rules about wood, VYNYL, even hedges, but nothing, absolutely nothing, about metal walls. So I made some calls, found a contractor willing to work fast, paid extra for expedited materials, and set a construction date. And that brings us to today. At 5 a.m. sharp, I fired up the chainsaw and tore down the old fence in the most obnoxious way possible. If Linda wanted to play dirty, I was more than happy to return the favor. By the time she stumbled out of her house, still half asleep in her robe, My crew was already unloading the steel sheets. The look on her face was priceless. "What in God's name are you doing?" she shrieked, running up to my driveway. I turned off the chainsaw and grinned. "Just making some updates." "You were right, Linda. The old fence had to go." Her eyes darted to the towering steel panels being drilled into place. This is illegal." I pulled out my copy of the HOA rule book, the one she had used to harass me for weeks, and flipped to the relevant section. "Actually, Linda, there's no rule against this." She gasped like a Victorian woman about to faint. "You can't do this." "I can't," I said, smiling. "And I am." She stormed off, mumbling something about an emergency HOA meeting. But I wasn't worried, because for the first time since moving in, I was actually looking forward to this battle. And I had only just begun. The barricade was coming together faster than I expected. By the time the sun fully rose, half of the steel sheets were already bolted into place. The sound of drilling and hammering echoed down the street, and it didn't take long before the entire neighborhood was awake, watching in stunned silence. Some of them whispered among themselves, others gawked like they were witnessing a crime scene. And then there was Linda, pacing back and forth on her driveway, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was calling the HOA board, probably demanding an emergency meeting, trying to get Simeone shut down my project. But there was nothing she could do. The barricade was completely legal. I had checked, double-checked, and triple-checked. There were no rules against steel walls. There were no height restrictions in the neighborhood's guidelines. Everything I was doing was within my rights. And Linda hated that more than anything. About an hour later, just as my crew was securing the final steel panel for the day, Linda stormed over again, this time dragging along a man in a cheap suit. His face was pale, nervous, like he had been forced into this confrontation against his will. "This is Mr. Thompson, our HOA lawyer," Linda announced, her voice dripping with triumph. "He's here to inform you that this monstrosity is a clear violation of community standards." I turned to the so-called lawyer, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. "Is that true?" I asked, folding my arms. "Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "Well, not exactly. The current HOA guidelines don't explicitly ban this kind of structure, but—" Linda cut him off. "But nothing. This is an eyesore. It's offensive, and it's destroying property values." I smirked. "That's funny. I remember you saying the same thing about my wooden fence." Her face turned a shade of red I didn't even know was possible. "This is completely different." Mr. Thompson looked between us like a man trapped in a burning building. "Legally speaking," he said carefully, "there's not much we can do. The board would have to vote on new regulations, and even then, they wouldn't apply retroactively. James is technically within his rights to build this structure." Linda's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might shatter. "Fine," she spat. "If the HOA won't do anything, I'll take this to the city. You just wait, James. You think you're smart, but you're going to regret this." I watched as she stormed off, practically dragging the lawyer behind her. The moment she disappeared into her house, one of my neighbors, an older guy named Tom who had lived in the neighborhood for years, walked over, grinning like a kid who just saw someone pull off the greatest prank in history. "Son," he said, chuckling, "I don't know what Linda did to piss you off this much, but I just want you to know that I have never been more entertained in my life. Hell, I'll even pitch in for materials if it means seeing her lose her mind." I laughed and clapped him on the back. "I appreciate it, Tom, but I've got this covered." Over the next few days, the barricade became the hottest topic in the neighborhood. Some people were furious, others found it hilarious. But regardless of their opinions, everyone was talking about it. Even the local news caught wind of the feud and sent a reporter to do a segment on the suburban battle of the century. Linda, of course, was doing everything in her power to stop me. She filed complaint after complaint with the city, claiming my barricade was a public safety hazard. She argued that it blocked emergency services, that it was structurally unsound, that it was ruining the charm of the community. None of it stuck. The city inspectors came out, took one look at my permits, and told her there was nothing they could do. That only made her angrier. She started harassing the workers I had hired, marching up to them in the middle of the day and demanding to see their licenses. When that didn't work, she tried bribing them to stop construction. That didn't work either. I had hired professionals, and they weren't about to throw away a paycheck because some entitled HOA president was throwing a tantrum. And then, just when I thought Linda had run out of ways to be a nuisance, she pulled out her biggest weapon yet. She called a town hall meeting. I got the official notice in my mailbox, written in the kind of aggressive legalese that only Linda could produce. The entire HOA board was being summoned, along with select homeowners, to discuss urgent community matters. In other words, she was staging a public execution, and I was the guest of honor. I wasn't worried. In fact, I was looking forward to it. The meeting was held in the local community center, a building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 90s. By the time I arrived, the place was packed. Homeowners filled the rows of metal folding chairs, whispering among themselves, glancing at me with curiosity and amusement. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long table like a panel of judges, were the HOA board members. And right in the middle, front and center, was Linda, looking smugger than ever. I took my seat near the back, arms crossed, waiting for the show to start. Linda wasted no time. She stood up, cleared her throat, and launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed like she had been practicing it in the mirror for days. She spoke about tradition, about community standards, about how my barricade was a threat to everything the neighborhood stood for. She painted me as a reckless, inconsiderate troublemaker who had come in and disrupted the harmony of the HOA. And then she turned to the board. "I demand that we take immediate legal action against this violation," she declared. "If we allow this kind of VY, or what's next? Neon-colored houses? Junk cars on the lawn? Anarchy." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Anarchy? Over a wall? This woman was out of her mind. One of the board members, an older woman named Margaret, cleared her throat. "Linda, as much as we appreciate your passion for the community, we have reviewed the guidelines extensively, and unfortunately, James's construction is not in violation of any current regulations." Linda's eyes bulged. "Then we changed the regulations." Margaret sighed. "We can vote on new guidelines, but as you well know, they won't apply retroactively." The room fell silent. Linda's face twisted in frustration, her fingers tightening around the papers in front of her. She knew she had lost. But Linda wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat gracefully. I decided to twist the knife a little. Raising my hand, I stood up. "If the HOA is so concerned about community standards," I said, "maybe we should also review some of the questionable decisions made by leadership." Linda turned to glare at me. "What are you implying?" I smiled. "Oh, just that I've been looking through some of the HOA's financial records. It's interesting how some funds seem to disappear when they involve certain people." A murmur spread through the crowd. Linda's expression flickered with panic for just a second before she masked it with anger. But I saw it, and so did everyone else. The board members exchanged glances. Margaret folded her hands and leaned forward. "James, would you be willing to provide more details about these concerns?" I shrugged. "Absolutely. In fact, I have copies." Linda's face went completely white. I knew then, without a doubt, that this war was far from over. But for the first time, I wasn't the one on the defensive. Linda had spent weeks trying to take me down. Now it was my turn. Linda didn't show up the next morning. For the first time in weeks, there was no dramatic confrontation, no furious stomping up my driveway, no threats of legal action. The neighborhood felt eerily quiet without her presence looming over everything. But I knew better than to think she had given up. Linda wasn't the type to accept defeat. If she wasn't out in the open, that meant she was working on something behind the scenes. I didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. Around noon, a black SUV rolled up in front of my house. The driver stepped out, adjusting his tie like he was preparing for a big moment. He was tall, clean-shaven, and had the kind of expression that screamed government official. He carried a leather briefcase, and as he walked toward my door, I caught a glimpse of the city's emblem on his lapel. Great. Linda had escalated this to the city level. I met him on the porch before he could even knock. "James, right?" he asked, offering a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's me," I said. "Let me guess you hear about the barricade." He gave a small nod. "I'm John Richards, City Zoning Inspector. We received a formal complaint regarding a potential code violation on your property. I was asked to conduct an inspection and verify compliance with local regulations." I smiled. By formal complaint, you mean Linda, right? He hesitated for a second before clearing his throat. I can't disclose the complainant's identity, but I assure you, this is a routine investigation. Routine. Sure. Because it was totally normal for a city official to be sent out over a perfectly legal structure that just happened to be annoying the neighborhood dictator. I stepped aside and motioned for him to take a look. Be my guest. John walked the perimeter of the barricade, pulling out a measuring tape, taking notes on a clipboard. I could see the gears turning in his head. He wanted to find something wrong with it. He wanted to give Linda the VY Tory she was so desperately clawing for. But there was nothing. After about 15 minutes of meticulous inspection, he sighed and tucked his notepad back into his briefcase. Well, he said, everything appears to be up to code. There's no violation here. I grinned. That's what I thought. He hesitated again, shifting uncomfortably. Look, he said, lowering his voice. Between you and me, I don't usually get sent out for things like this. But your HOA president is. Persistent. I snorted. That's one way to put it. Off the record, he said. She's already filed 3 additional complaints. If you don't take this thing down, she's going to keep coming after you. I leaned against the barricade and crossed my arms. Let her. John sighed, gave me a nod, and walked back to his SUV. As he drove away, I turned to see Linda standing in her yard, watching from behind her curtains. The moment she saw me looking, she yanked them shut. She was furious, and that only made me more determined. 2 days later, I got another official letter from the HOA. This time, Linda wasn't just threatening fines, she was demanding a full-blown legal battle. The letter accused me of willful defiance of community standards and stated that the HOA was seeking a court order to force the removal of my barricade. It was laughable. She was acting like I had built a toxic waste dump instead of a legal structure on my own property. But if she wanted to drag this into court, I was more than ready. I called my lawyer, handed him the letter, and let him go to work. Within a day, he had drafted a counterclaim not only defending my right to keep the barricade, but also accusing Linda of harassment, selective enforcement of HOA rules, and even financial misconduct within the association. And that's when everything changed. A week before our court date, a bombshell dropped. My lawyer had been digging through HOA records, looking for inconsistencies, and he found something huge. Linda had been misusing HOA funds for years, small amounts here and there, disguised as administrative fees, personal reimbursements, and vague maintenance costs that had no receipts attached. The total wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to raise serious questions. And more importantly, it was enough to get the rest of the HOA board involved. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be about my barricade. Instead, it turned into Linda's public reckoning. The room was packed. Homeowners filled every seat, and a few even had to stand in the back. People who had never cared about HOA politics before suddenly had a vested interest in what was about to go down. Even the board members looked uneasy, whispering among themselves as they shuffled papers. Linda sat at the center of the long table at the front of the room, her usual air of confidence replaced with Cybele tension. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how bad it was going to be. When the meeting started, she immediately launched into her usual speech, talking about how I had defied the HOA and how my barricade was destroying the integrity of the neighborhood. Then my lawyer stood up. Before we address the barricade issue, he said, there's another matter that requires immediate attention. He placed a stack of documents on the table and slid them toward the board members. These are financial records from the past 5 years, he continued. They show a pattern of unauthorized expenses charged to the HOA budget, many of which were approved solely by Linda Reynolds, the acting president. The room went silent. Linda stiffened in her chair. This is absurd, she said quickly. I've always acted in the best interest of the community. Then I assume you won't mind an independent audit, my lawyer interrupted. A murmur spread through the crowd. People started whispering, exchanging looks. The board members flipped through the papers, their faces darkening with every page. One of them, Margaret, looked up. Linda, she said carefully, these are serious accusations. If these transactions can't be properly accounted for, we may need to vote on your removal from the HOA board. Linda's eyes darted around the room. For the first time since I met her, she looked genuinely afraid. You can't do this, she said, voice shaking. I've dedicated years to this community. Tom, the older neighbor who had supported me from the start, stood up. Yeah, and you've made our lives miserable in the process, he said. You know what? I vote to remove her. Right now. A few voices immediately echoed in agreement. Then more. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with people cheering for Linda's removal. The board members exchanged glances. Margaret took a deep breath. Effective immediately, she said, Linda Reynolds is suspended from the HOA board pending a full financial review. Linda shot up from her chair, face pale, hands trembling. This isn't over, she whispered before grabbing her purse and storming out of the meeting. But it was over. Linda put her house up for sale the next month. The HOA dropped the lawsuit against me, and the Barricade still stands. In fact, it became something of a local landmark, a symbol of fighting back against ridiculous HOA tyranny. And as for me, well, the next HOA election rolled around, and a few neighbors jokingly suggested I should run for president. I didn't even have to campaign. I won by a landslide. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.